Good morning. Welcome to Class Again Together. We are in the 11th lesson of our study on the life of Moses. Today, we meet Moses having to do something that we all will do at one point in our life. On March the 4th, 1865, the Civil War was about to end, and Abraham Lincoln gave his second inaugural address. In it, he told of the future, a future which he had hoped to knit a torn Union back together again. And his words have resounded through history when he says, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in. It was a bold vision, but 6 weeks later, an assassin's bullet took his life and his vision. His successor, Andrew Jackson, was really not up to the task. It's vital for great work and vision to have time. And to do that, there comes a moment when the torch has to be passed. Death or disability claims leaders, and something or someone must pick up the mantle. Now, the question is, who will they be? That's the situation in Numbers chapter 27. The time has come for Moses to pass the torch. He is about to die, and someone must take his place. So in this chapter of transition, we see that what God wants from the present and future leaders of the people. It's a lesson that will determine the future strength or the future demise in all generations. Let's see Moses as he passes the torch. The time that we are in today is the journey to Canaan is about to draw to a close. The people refused to go into the promised land in Numbers 13, which led to 40 years of wilderness wandering, a little of which we really do know much about. They battled through Moab and Ammon, and now they are encamped at Kadesh Barnea, on the doorstep of their final push into the promised land. It is here that it comes for Moses to step aside. God says to him, "Go up to this mountain of Abiram and see the land that I have given to the people of Israel. When you have seen it, you also shall be gathered to your people as your brother Aaron was, because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin when the congregation quarreled, failing to uphold me as holy at the waters before their eyes." God tells him it's time to go to a mountain called Abiram. It seems that this is just another term for a peak that is called by many names, including Nebo. And here on this mountain, Moses will capture the vista envisioned for centuries, from the Golan Heights in the north to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, to the Red Sea to the south, and to the vast Arabian deserts to the east. He will see the culmination of a promise to the patriarchs. It started with the pain of the plagues, led them to the miracle of the sea, through the complaints and rebellions of the desert. And now, all he was allowed to do was look. Because of his self-willed refusal to follow God's instructions in Numbers 20, he could only see, but never enter. But who would step into his sandals? Think about this. For 40 years, Moses has been the leader, the shepherd, the prophet to the people. Who can compare to Moses? Who is going to fill the shoes of a Moses? It's a hard thing to think about. The truth, though, is that no one really can. But the right person must take his place to take the next step that perhaps Moses was not able to take anyway. And that was recognized by Moses himself. And so as Moses contemplates his own death, he speaks with the Lord. Let the Lord, the God of spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep that have no shepherd. It was Moses who spoke up about this issue of succession. He didn't try to hold on to his authority to maintain his position. It takes a man of great moral and spiritual strength to stand aside when the time comes. There are many who like to grasp power and hold it, but Moses reveals the true depth of his faith. He's willing to turn loose to someone else. Moses knew a great truth that we must learn in order to serve God. The Lord's work does not depend on a single man. It continues when we are gone. Moses had done what he could do, and now he had to realize that the Lord's work was so much greater than he. Tragically, I've watched a lot of church leaders throughout my life believe that without them, the church or the movement would fail. However, anything built on a single man is destined for failure. Anything that is God's depends on his power. So men can come and go, but the plan will continue. That's what we see in this passage. But what kind of man? Moses didn't say, anybody will do. It's going to take a special kind of man. Moses said he should go out before them and come in before them. He shall lead them out and bring them in. The congregation of the Lord may not be with a sheep with no shepherd. Moses returns to the 40 years before when he was a shepherd for sheep. Whether we like it or not, and to the dismay of some, that's a pretty apt description. We really don't know which way to go. We don't know the door to go to. We don't know when to go in and when to stay out. We need someone with wisdom and knowledge and experience to lead us. But Moses says this is not just a ceremonial position. It's not a position of power. This is not a board member or a CEO to make decisions for the people. That's not what any of this portrays. He says Moses needs to be a shepherd who cares for the people. He doesn't want them to be sheep without the shepherd. Now, that's the same image that the New Testament imports for church leaders. Compassionate visionaries who don't demand allegiance, but who receive it because people know that they are caring for them in the hardest parts of their lives. So God had a name well known to Moses. The man's name was Joshua. So the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hands on him." It's an interesting choice, but remember, we see Joshua in retrospect. We have already read through the book of Joshua. We have already seen what he was able to do. We know of him conquering the land. We know the battles fought at Ai and Jericho. We've heard the speech of "Choose this day whom you shall serve." We see the end of the story, but they're not there yet. They can't see that. In Numbers 27, he's probably not as well known as we know him to be. But why Joshua? God knew that Joshua was qualified, as did Moses, but what made him the best choice? Why would the people follow him? Well, the first thing it says, he is a man of the Spirit. Take Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hands on him. It says a man in whom is the Spirit. Joshua's heart vibrates along with God's. This may be the most important trait for a church leader and for God's leader, because you see it is repeated over and over and over again in all the Bible. It describes John the Baptist, it describes Elijah, and we see it as a key trait in the leadership of the early church. In Acts 6, the church is overwhelmed with this great growth that's wildly falling on the apostles' shoulders. They have heard these tales of neglect, and yet for them to take on all of this task, all of these things, and try to touch every little thing would not be helpful. It would cause the progress to skid off the road. Instead, they have to appoint assistants. But not just anyone will do. One of those chosen is a man named Stephen, and he's described much in the same terms as Joshua. And what they said pleased the whole gathering, and they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit. God judges leadership differently than man does. A man asks a question, what does he produce? What results come from him? And that's why often, in my experience at least, we've installed successful businessmen as elders. We've seen them in business and assume that translates that over. It doesn't really translate over as much as we think it is. After all, we say it shows they can run something, but the church is not something to run. That's the problem that Samuel experienced. He too had to choose a successor to a fallen Saul. So he starts looking at all the human traits that we consider important to leadership. And in his time, what that meant was size, strength, and the ability to be seen quickly in a battle. They needed this strength, this stature, and they needed to be impressive. That's everything that Saul was, and that's everything that every king in all of history seems to have been. So he says, if that's what the model of leadership is, that's what we're going to do. And yet, when he comes to all of Jesse's sons, he puts an X next to their name. He passes by the best human specimens, and he waves Samuel off. And then he reveals his filter for leadership. Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. What kind of heart does he have? Now, he may fight well, but does he serve me? Does he help the people? God's surveying hearts, not spiritual gift inventories, and he realizes and he sees and he knows that Joshua has the Spirit. The truth is that a great leader without God's Spirit will never be God's leader. He'll just be another run-of-the-mill manager. But there's a second trait that is marked in the plus column for Joshua. He serves as Moses' assistant. In Exodus chapter 33, as Moses is on the mountain, we read this passage that says, the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. When Moses turned again into the camp, his assistant, Joshua, son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. Joshua was a young man. He was a neophyte. He needed to be trained, and he was standing side by side with Moses much of the time. He spent a lot of time with Moses. He was loyal to him. He wouldn't leave the tent without him. In short, he served an apprenticeship under Moses. Now, there's something that happens when young men spend time with older, seasoned ones. They start to learn subtle things like how to speak to the hurting or to the rebel without hurting the situation. They learn thinking and they learn decision making that can't be taught in books, and that classes are dry and esoteric. But when you see somebody in the trenches, someone who's doing the work day to day, you learn so much. No school in the world can train like a seasoned man can. Because I know I've been blessed to have such men like that in my life that I've learned from all my life. Joshua received the best training for the task by standing beside Moses. He was well trained. But one of the places that Joshua shined was in Numbers 13 and 14. He served as one of the 12 spies who Moses sent into the land as they were on the cusp of entering the very first time. As the spies came back, they brought us a magnificent report, but there was a but. But there are giants there. And that caused a great despair of the majority. 10 out of 12 said we can't. But two men stood in opposition. One was Caleb, and the other was Joshua. In Numbers 14, we hear Joshua speaking. And Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, whom were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes and said to all the congregation of the people of Israel, the land which we passed through to spy out, it's an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he'll bring us into this land and will give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Joshua knew that the Lord's hand would guide them even in the shadow of the giants. They could take the land. Now, it's interesting that Joshua and Caleb make that statement because it's difficult to stand against a strong majority. People tend to go with their social circle. Even if you don't agree with people, you'll kind of nod your head like you do. But a man of principle doesn't merely follow the loudest voices. He stands on the truth of God and not on speeches. Joshua would have to stand up to that kind of opposition. And so he proves that he can. But there's one more trait that distinguishes him from someone else. I think it could be argued, why not Caleb? Caleb did exactly the same thing that Joshua did. And that's not to say that Caleb was inferior to Joshua, but there's one trait that Joshua seemed to have that Caleb, we're not told, ever had very much of. He didn't have that much experience in it. Joshua knew what it was like to fight in war. Before the people arrived at Sinai, they had to deal with the marauders called the Amalekites, a tribe of warriors that would cause constant trouble to Israel throughout the centuries. And Moses tapped Joshua to lead the charge. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand at the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Joshua was not Moses, but God didn't need another Moses now. Moses led with his strength when he needed to lead. The people needed an experienced desert shepherd to get them through the wilderness. He was the perfect spokesman for God with the law. He was more patient than I would have been. But when the people came to Canaan, they would need to topple walled cities and drive out the inhabitants of the land. And that required skills of a war strategist. And it was a gift that Joshua seemed to have. So then it came time to pass the torch. So the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Make him stand before Eleazar the priest and all the congregation, and you shall commission him in their sight. You shall invest him with some of your authority, that all the congregation of Israel may obey. And he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire for him by the judgment of the Urim before the Lord. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and the people of Israel with him, the whole congregation." God always does things for specific reasons. He wants people to see that God is involved with this, that this is God's will and not Moses' will. But he also wants people to see that Moses is good with this. So he makes this very public, and it's sanctioned by the high priest. They're to stand in front of the people, the whole congregation, and this congregation can witness with their own eyes that Joshua is now the new leader, and Moses will place his hands on him. This is not a mystical symbol, but it's a sign that I have agreed with this decision, and he gets my authority. I am now transferring my authority to him. Nothing worse can happen to a leader than for the people to ignore him because that person is not the predecessor. Instead, God shows the people that Joshua is the new leader going forward. But Joshua is also showing himself subservient to God's will. It says that he'll ask the priest to inquire for him with a human, a way of casting lots that we probably don't completely understand. And yet, in that moment, it says that when he needs to inquire of the Lord, he will get the message of God as well. But he will do it in the way I have specified. That was different from Moses. And in God's economy in general, the leader always stands under the authority of God's will and never on their own. One verse, though, lifts Moses higher in status than I think perhaps any other in this passage. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him. Moses did all that the Lord had commanded him. He was not resentful. He was not angry. He was not hurt. He accepted God's will as it was, as the best, and did what God wanted him to do. It takes a great leader to step aside when the time has come, and so he does exactly that. He knows that God has specified this, and it was something that he needed to do, and so he obeys completely. He has no grasp on leadership or on power. He doesn't see himself as that important, but is just a servant of God. That's something we see in the rest of the Bible. Elijah passes a mantle to Elisha. And when we go to the New Testament, when John the Baptist is at the apex of his popularity, where these crowds are just thronging to him, and Jesus is beginning to ascend to his proper place of ministry. John has a depth of spirit to point to Jesus and recognize his role and say, he must increase, but I must decrease. And that's exactly what Moses did. He leads Israel as far as he can and then turns it over to Joshua to lead in the future. It shows his character and his great leadership to recognize the situation and do what is best. This session points to one of the principles that every preacher, every elder, and every leader needs to remember. God's plan is larger than any one man. God doesn't build his church on men, but on Jesus himself. Men will come and go, but the Lord's plan will continue. When death comes, we pass it on, and the Lord continues. When we step away from leadership, we turn loose, and we don't try to stay in control, because the Lord has the control. But as we come to the close of this lesson, let's take a few moments to reflect on this passing of the torch. First, I think we can see that Moses was the right man for his mission. Moses served according to his gifts and abilities. He couldn't do everything, but when it came to leading the people from Egypt to Canaan, no one could have done it better. I don't think Joshua could have done that. Only Moses could have. God chose the right man at the right time. But the second is, Moses was not the right man for the next phase. A shepherd could not be a general. For that, it would take a Joshua. Leaders need to learn to face both their strengths and their limitations. Lead with your strength, but be honest about what that strength is. But when the situation changes, step back. Let another man pass the torch. Take it, give it to the man who has the set of talents and abilities to do that. But then third, Moses was humble enough to step aside. Too many leaders get intoxicated with their power or their position. They need the trappings, the admiration, the control, the title. And that will always hamper a transition and will hamstring the next leader. He has to be able to say to himself and to others, it is time. Paul would say we should not think of ourselves higher than we ought to think, but think with sober judgment. Know when you have done all that you can do, and then it's time to pass the torch. You can then be at peace, and the Lord can proceed without you in the way. After all, the day will come where we will all be gone. So spend your life preparing someone and yourself for the next phase. Moses would climb Nebo for the side of the land of promise and never return. He invested his life in Joshua, who would continue his legacy. When we accept our place of taking God's plan as far as we can and making sure there is someone after us, we have fulfilled God's will for our lives. But to do that, you have to remember, no man is indispensable. When General Dwight Eisenhower went into D-Day on June 6, 1944, he wrote a letter just in case the assault on the Allied forces were repelled and they lost the most important battle of the war. In it, he claimed any blame for defeat and no credit for victory. 20 years later, he returned to Normandy to speak on the 20th anniversary of the landing. But instead of making a speech, he recited a poem he kept in his pocket, both at D-Day and ever since. It's written anonymously, but expresses a single idea. No one is indispensable in this life. In fact, the title of the poem is The Indispensable Man. Sometimes when you feel important, sometimes when your ego's in bloom, sometimes when you take it for granted you're the best qualified in the room, sometimes when you feel that your going would leave an unfillable hole, just follow these simple instructions and see how they humble your soul. Take a bucket and fill it with water. Put your hand in it up to the wrist. Now pull it out, and the hole that's remaining is a measure of how much you'll be missed. You can splash all you wish when you enter. You may stir the water galore, but stop and you'll find that in no time it looks the same as before. The moral of this quaint example is to do just the best that you can. Be proud of yourself, but remember, there is no indispensable man. Be prepared to pass the torch, for God will be served. Thank you for joining me today. It's been my pleasure to be with you, and I hope that you've enjoyed our study together. Next week, we move to chapter 12, where Moses says goodbye to this life at the top of Mount Nebo. We write his obituary. Thank you for being with me, and I hope you have a great day and a great week, and I'll see you again next Sunday.